Hi, my name is Daria Mizantsova and welcome to Politeka World Show. And today we have a talk with ex-Navy SEAL and writer, American writer, film producer, and the person who really supports Ukraine very much. So with us today is Chuck Pfarrer. Chuck, I'm happy to have you here.
That's good to be with you. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, I'm really proud to have the person as you on my show, because for me it's really important to build this dialogue with the American audience and with the experts from America who support us 100%. Yeah, so thank you for joining the show.
My pleasure. Absolutely.
Yeah, and before the interview, because you told me that you had the story from Ukraine, that your relatives helped some people in Ukraine to evacuate. So tell me more about it, because it's interesting to build this dialogue with people in America.
Right. My family lives near New Orleans in the south of the United States. Many years ago, my family met a Ukrainian woman who'd married a friend of the family, Nadia. I won't say her last name. She became a sort of member of the family. And just after the invasion, the second invasion, the first one happened, of course, in 2014. Her parents were living in Kyiv. Things were very dangerous. They're older people. We were able to help her get her parents out of Kyiv and into the United States. And they live in our town. They are wonderful friends of ours. Just a small thing that we could do, but it meant so much because we love Nadia, and it made all of this really a lot more personal for our family.
Yeah, I got to. I have my friends who moved from Bucha at the time when the Russian militants entered this area. So I understand what are you talking about. So, Chuck, let's talk about the last developments on the ground and around the war in Ukraine. So we hear from Ukrainian officials that the war is on the third stage right now, from fourth of them, yeah. And our militants told us that it's time for offensive warfare. And do you agree that the half of the war has been passed, or the two last stages can be much longer than that in the past?
One of the things that I think that the Russians have shown right now, and I am not one of those people that think the war will be over soon. I think the war will go on, but for some time. But very importantly, I think that the war is in a place now that the Russians can no longer win it. They've shown that with the army that they have, with their leadership and their tactics, they cannot defeat Ukraine. Especially, I think we see an example in what's going on right now in Bakhmut. The war there was essentially, I won't say a stalemate, but it was just slowly going back and forth, with the Russians losing hundreds and hundreds of people every day, and the Ukrainians fighting in a very smart and dynamic defense. Just this morning, or just over the last day, the Russians made a lunge at Soledar, north of Bakhmut. They initially had some success, and as it inevitably seems to happen, when the Russians move forward, the Ukrainians push them back. And that has happened in Soledar. And today, the Ukrainian air defense shot down 3 Russian attack helicopters, 3 UAVs, and I will make a bold prediction that the Ukrainian armed forces will push them back out of Soledar. This is another example of the sort of fruitless attacks that Russia is putting together. Ukraine is too much of an enemy for Russia, and that's a good thing.
And how do you feel if we compare the tactics of Ukrainian military forces and I could tell Russia sort of forces? So what is the difference between their tactics?
Well, one of the most important things is something that you can't really put your hands on. That would be fighting spirit and morale. Every day, the Russians are getting colder and tireder and hungrier and more frustrated. The Russian mobilization that we saw a couple of months ago, 300,000 people were delivered into the Russian armed forces. They showed up at the front. They had no training, no will to fight, no ability to fight. They were plunged into units where instead of reinforcing the units, they actually sort of poisoned them. These were people who were dissatisfied. They complain. They make videos complaining about the way they're treated. In any other army, that is mutiny. That's what the United States military calls a mutinous combination. And those are troops that are not going to be good for fighting. On the other hand, Ukraine, increasingly trained to a NATO standard, junior officers and NCOs are encouraged to improvise on the battlefield. They're given tactical responsibility. They are able to exploit breakthroughs as they see fit, and that's the kind of army that cannot be defeated.
Yeah, and also if we are talking about the next counteroffensive by Ukraine, so British told us that the Russian militants afraid of the counteroffensive by Ukrainian military forces on the Zaporizhia direction and on Lugansk direction. So how do you observe such thing? How quickly Ukraine can be prepared for the attack of the enemy from these directions?
Well, those will be the directions that Russia will attack from, because they will have the most secure lines of communication and supply. What the Ukrainians are what the Russians are going to have to look out for, and this will inevitably happen. Ukraine is going to launch an offensive at some time during this war. They will drive south to the Sea of Azov, and there they will split the Russian forces in half. I don't know when this is going to happen, but I promise you, when the book is written about the war in Ukraine, there will be a battle of Melitopol, and that battle will be the beginning of the end of Russia's occupation of Ukraine.
But if we were talking about the prospects of the war, so where can be the place for this time when these steps could be done by Ukrainian military forces? So in 1 month, in 2 months,
Yeah, I do think this. There will be a winter offensive. I have a couple of ideas where it will fall. I don't think I'll mention them today. Maybe I'll write them on a note and we can look in the future. There is definitely going to be a winter offensive. I think it will be, of course, when the ground gets a little harder, but also more importantly, the Ukrainian armed forces are going to pick a time and a place where their offensive action will be most effective. And one of the considerations will be geographical, where that will fall. But it will also be very important. That blow will fall where the Russian troops are least prepared and are the most miserable. Because as this winter continues, Russia's supply shortages of ammunition, and simple winter equipment, uniforms, are going to punish the Russian soldiers. And we have already seen, for example, in Bakhmut, there are dozens of Russian casualties every day, and those are from the weather. And as winter gets worse, the Russian army will be further weakened by those conditions.
Yeah, I agree with you, but we have not good news from Russia about the future mobilization of 500,000 cannon fodder and President of Ukraine, Zelenskiy, warned us that Russians are preparing for a new offensive from their side, as well as we are doing the same. How will it reflect the perspectives, for example, of US help? And do you think Ukraine need to mobilize more citizens, liable for military service as well?
Well, the first thing I would look at is the Russian mobilization. Uh, Russia, like any enemy, you can never underestimate your enemy, and no one ever should. But the first mobilization of 300,000 people had virtually no effect on the war. We saw dozens of videos of truckloads of Russian civilians. They weren't even trained soldiers being dropped off in a field with no equipment, no weapons, no one to meet them. It was an absolute disaster, this mobilization from front to back. This coming mobilization, which will be almost twice as big, will probably have the same effect. And here is one of the reasons why. You can't just call up 500,000 civilians and turn them into soldiers. It is a process that takes months. And if you're training those soldiers to be anything other than infantry, if you're training them to be artillerymen or air defense technicians or tankers or artillerymen or on and on, strategic rocket forces, then the training takes years. It doesn't take months and it doesn't take weeks. There's also the question of supplying these people and moving them into cohesive military units. And that is a problem that Russia is going to have a very hard time solving, because the men and women who would train those forces, they are already on the ground in Ukraine fighting. There isn't a structure and there isn't a training nucleus in Russia to train them. So this call up is coming. I absolutely agree with the president. It is going to happen. But whether or not those men and women are going to be effective on the battlefield, that really remains to be seen.
Can we state, Chuck, that the partnerships between Russia and the other countries who are partly, for example, on their side, didn't work out for them, especially on the front line? It only can give some possibilities to allow Russia to make some terror around the other cities.
Yeah, Russia's allies, they're not very good friends. And let's face it, if you are a bully and you have friends, just think back to your schoolyard days. As soon as that bully gets beaten, nobody is his friend. Vladimir Putin has friends like Iran and Belarus and North Korea. Those are not countries that are going to come through from him. The big problem in this war is actually, it is not really Ukraine fighting Russia. It is Ukraine fighting Vladimir Putin. This war was his idea. Everything he set out to do has failed. He set out on this war to weaken NATO. He's strengthened it. He didn't like NATO so close. Now Finland is in NATO. Now Sweden is in NATO. He started out as a superpower, and now the world has seen that he isn't even a regional power. And the worst thing for Putin is, if he loses this war, he's going to lose his job. And that doesn't mean he's going to go to Florida and retire. He'll be out.
So that's why we could say that Putin won't stop his attacks in near time. So, or we could find some ways how it could be stopped.
Well, it's another one of those things that I would love it if Mr. Putin would simply go away, but he is a blood-soaked dictator. He came to power. He is merciless, and he is a smart enough man to realize that there will be no mercy for him. The only solution for him, as he sees it, is to win this war in Ukraine. And although I predict the war will go on for months now to come, perhaps 2 more years, but I solidly say this: the Russians can no longer win this war in Ukraine. They don't have the means, they don't have the plan, they don't have the ability to carry it out. And there's a couple of key things that aren't going to change for Russia. Ukraine is being provided with some of the best intelligence that any warfighter has ever had, certainly since World War II. The Russians can't do anything in occupied Ukraine that Ukraine doesn't know about. Satellites from NATO are overhead. That information is communicated to Ukraine. But more importantly, in real time, wherever the Russians move in Luhansk, Donetsk, south of the Dnipro, they are surrounded by Ukrainian patriots. And some of those patriots are partisans. And that information gets directly into the ear of Ukrainian warfighters. And that's why we see headquarters buildings being struck, barracks being struck, ammunition depots being struck. Everywhere the Russians stand on occupied Ukraine, they are surrounded by people who don't want them there. And that's never going to change. And it's pretty hard to win a war. As the United States found out in Vietnam and Afghanistan, you can't win that kind of war.
Yeah, and also I would like to mention some figures which were claimed by Defense Minister of Ukraine, Alexei Reznikov, and he published an updated infographic on the number of Russian missiles. And he told us that the enemy has 19% of strategic high-precision missiles, about 78% of tactical missiles, and only 12% of Iranian drones. So with such military potential, how broad is the possibility for Russia to attack Ukraine on the battlefield? And how broad is the potential to increase this military potential?
Well, an important number is, and although it sounds incredible, these are the statistics. Every time Russia fires a guided weapon, 98% of the time it's targeted on civilians, civilian population centers, and civilian infrastructure. I agree with those numbers. Russia has burned through its precision strike cruise missiles. Having 16% left is not a good position for a country like Russia that has ostensibly global responsibilities. It also says quite a lot about, for example, the Shahed 136s. It has 16% of those left. Ukraine is in the process of increasing its air defense capabilities. In particular, the Shahed 136, because it is slow and because it has a relatively wide cross-section, they're getting down sometimes in a 100% engagement. Ukraine will shoot down 100% of the Shahed 136s. Overall, Ukraine is shooting down about 70% of Russian cruise missiles, but in some cases and some engagements, Ukraine is shooting down 90, 80, 75%. Those are actually great air defense numbers, but unfortunately, because Russia targets civilians, just 1 or 2 of those getting through is terrible. But you've pointed out that really one of the most important things is, as Ukraine's air defense gets better and better, and fewer of those Russian missiles strike, it's only a resource drain on Russia. They have a hard time reproducing those precision strike munitions. They've had to enter into a production agreement with Iran. And it's becoming increasingly futile for Russia to attack Ukraine with cruise missiles and air-launched missiles, and that is a good thing. Right now, Russia is shooting at cities and population centers and power plants. Pretty soon, Russia is going to have to shoot at large groups of maneuvering combined arms offensives by Ukraine. And those weapons aren't going to be there. And the Ukrainians are just going to keep coming. So the future is bright for Ukraine, and it's very dark for Russia.
Yeah, and if we're talking about the last packet of military defense from US, there were a lot of artillery which Ukraine needs and so on. How do you estimate the last military packet for Ukraine? How possible is a counterattack with such a quantity of weapons?
Well, there's going to be like 4 acts to this war. The first act, unfortunately, was Russia's hybrid warfare against the East. The second act was the Russian offensive that we saw begin last year. Ukraine couldn't win that war, but very wisely switched to asymmetrical warfare, meaning they couldn't take on the Russians directly, but they did take on their lines of communication and supply. They were very smart to pull their air force back to preserve the nucleus of it. We've now reached the point where Ukraine has been able to thwart Russian further offensives. We're going to transition to the last 2 acts of that war, starting with the winter offensive. And from then on, and what's going to win this war are going to be large brigade, task group, and larger sizes of Ukrainian combined arms offensives. Traditional ground offensives, armor, artillery, air, infantry, all working together. And these are going to push back and reoccupy Russian territory. Ukraine has already carried out 2 very successful offensives against Kharkiv, which drove the line of contact from Kharkiv all the way back to the P-66 highway in Savatove, and of course, taking back Kherson on the north back of the Dnipro. Starting this winter, Ukraine is going to transition to those large combined arms offensives. We're also seeing, and we're going to see more, the NATO countries are going to be given more modern battle tanks, Leopards and Leopard 2s. And the United States has announced that it is going to be giving Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine, also training up a cadre of 500 Ukrainian crews to use those Bradleys in combat. Those Bradleys, again, are vital for fighting in cities. They are great in scouting roles. And when this comes to this force-on-force engagement, armored division on armored division, normally the entire world would have thought 2 years ago that wouldn't be a battle that Ukraine could win. That somehow the legacy of Russia's ex-Soviet might made that look like no one could defeat them on the battlefield. However, the world has seen the ineptitude of the Russian leadership. They've seen the lack of morale of the Russian fighting forces. And as I've pointed out, later in this winter, that morale of those Russian forces is going to be even worse. And those people, motivated like that, badly supplied, tired, and badly led, will not be able to fight off these offensives. I see much more sacrifice coming on the part of Ukraine, but I see much more successes.
Yeah, and if we take into account the problem with artillery shells. I mean, recently I had the talks with different military experts, and they told me that for Ukraine on the battlefield, the significant thing now is to increase the quantity of artillery shells. Did you observe that this problem has been solved?
Well, I don't think it's been solved. When people ask me in an interview, what does Ukraine need? I say they need more of everything, and they need it right now. But it's almost a metaphor for the entire war, what's going on in artillery. Every day, every Russian gun on the front line will fire hundreds, if not 1,000 shells. The Russians don't usually even aim at anything. They aim at the nearest village that is across the line of contact. They fire thousands, tens of thousands of shells every day. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, use their drones when they have them. They use Excalibur precision targeting rounds when they have. And the Ukrainians hit at only selective, what we call lucrative targets. And to put this in a better way, the Russians seem to shoot at everything, and the Ukrainians only shoot at things that are important. And one of the principal targets of the Ukrainian precision strike munitions, very intelligently, has been to strike at the Russians' ammunition storage depots. And every night on the news, we see 5, 10, sometimes a dozen of those ammunition depots going up at night. And every one of those exploding shells is a shell that won't be landing on Ukraine. And critically, when the offensive comes, those are shells that the Russian army will not be able to target Ukrainian maneuver elements. And we've already seen Russian forces complaining that they can't get enough artillery. Well, the Ukrainians are going to give them some artillery, but not the way they really wanted to get it.
Yeah. And Chuck, how do you feel about reoccupation of Crimea? As we know, some American military experts and Ukrainian as well, they told us that the reoccupation of Crimea could be even in spring and summer, and after that could be the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia with, for example, with Turkey or with US. Yeah. So how do you estimate such progress for the future?
Well, it's interesting. For Putin, I think Crimea is the prize. That's the last thing that he can afford to give up, having lost 100,000 men. But it's interesting. Holding Crimea is not really going to be that easy for him, because Crimea is not so much a peninsula, but it's really almost an island. From the Ukrainian mainland, there are only two roads, the M17 and the M18. Those are the only two highways that go in there. They cross at very narrow points. Putin built the Kerch Bridge. That was his idea. So you have Ukraine, you have Crimea, and it's only connected by those three small points. And it is very much in the possibility that Ukraine can cut off the land side approaches, the M17 and the M18. This will take a considerable offensive, but it can be done. And at that point, only the Kerch Bridge will connect Crimea and Russia. And we've already seen that Ukraine can cut the Kerch Bridge when it wants to. Again, no real predictions on my part, except to say there will be a battle of Melitopol. There will be another battle of Mariupol, and that will sever the land connection that Putin needs to hold on to Ukraine, to Crimea. And with that severed, I don't see how he's going to supply it, and I don't see how he's going to maintain forces there.
And Chuck, how can you observe the attainment of the peace in Ukraine to the point of the depletion of resources of Russia in order to avert its collapse and breakdown into different parts? So how do you see these scenarios?
Well, I hate to make political predictions, but Putin holds on to things by force and intimidation, and he is going to lose the war in Ukraine. He's going to lose it. It's probably not going to happen next year, and it might not happen the year after, but it is inevitably going to happen. Now, whether or not the friends he's made by bullying, will they stick around him? I don't think so. There may come a point where other powers in Russia, not just Putin, but other powerful personalities, will realize that for the good, if you could call it good, of Russia, Putin will have to step down because he is so identified with this war, and he is so identified with the failure of Russian arms. That being said, Putin is not going to want to leave. He is a ruthless dictator. He will kill as many enemies or perceived enemies as he thinks. It's very difficult for me to make a prediction about Putin. He's already losing the few friends he has because I'm not the only analyst who looks at this war and does not see a Russian victory. And there won't be a Russian victory for several reasons. The generals he has now are utterly inept. The troops he has are increasingly unwilling, and the rest of the world is looking at this naked act of aggression, and they don't want to see it happen. So Ukraine is not going to run out of supplies. It is going to be supplied. It's going to be supported politically, and I just don't see Russia pulling this off. I frankly don't.
Yeah. So, but you did tell me the thing that war won't finish till 2025. You think because you told about the next year, even when then the year after that. So how long could Ukrainians wait for it? Are there any decisive factors you could observe right now on the global map concerning, for example, even relations between between USA and China and Russia? So, if we are talking about political moments that can minimize the term of this this war.
I would love it. And there are things that would change the calculus completely. Absolutely. For example, what would happen to Putin after two more extraordinarily effective Ukrainian offensives? That could change what's happening in the Kremlin. One of the problems going on now is, and you couldn't make a better cartoon dictator than Putin, sitting alone at a 40-foot table with his generals at the other end. That's a metaphor for his leadership style. One of the reasons Russia is losing this war is no one can tell Putin the truth. Nobody can tell him what isn't working. There is a battle going on in Bakhmut because Vladimir Putin has put his finger on a map and said, I want this city. It doesn't matter to his generals if Bakhmut is essentially, it's not unimportant, but it isn't vital to beating Ukraine. Resources, men, material are being burned up in this city for a political decision of Putin's. He's doing everything he can to avoid direct responsibility for the war, but he has already fired 4 commanders. 4 Russian generals in charge of the special military operation have already been fired. He has a schism between his private military contractors, Wagner, and the Ministry of Defense. That's terrific. Let's let the enemies fight among each other. If there are several large Russian reverses on the battlefield, it will definitely affect Putin behind the scenes, but it's going to make him more paranoid, and it's going to make him only slightly less stable in his position, I think.
Yeah, I got you, Chuck. Thank you for this interview, and it was a pleasure to talk with you. And We really appreciate the support from US citizens, and we really want this war will last not 2 years, but
No,
much quicker will be ended. So yeah, so we need, I think, more military help as well to do it.
thank you. And I am an optimistic pessimist, but I do want to end by saying this: Ukraine is going to win this war. They are, and I would like that to happen tomorrow if I could, but it'll happen soon. I promise you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I appreciate if you will take part one more time in our show.
I would be very happy. Thank you very much for asking me.
Don't forget to be subscribed to Politeka World to be in the heart of the significant news about war in Ukraine. Leave comments because your point of view is extremely important for us. Thank you to be with us. See you in the next show.